The day respect went quiet. The rain over Harlem that morning fell the way grief often does, steady, unannounced, impossible to ignore. It darkened the sidewalks and softened the noise of the city until even the sirens felt respectful, as if they too understood that something important had ended. The funeral home stood heavy with history and whispers, its brick face worn smooth by decades of sorrow and pride. Inside, men who had learned to survive by never bowing their heads now stood with their eyes lowered, coats buttoned, voices reduced to murmurs. This was the farewell to Bumpy Johnson, a man whose name carried power, fear, contradiction, and to many in the room, protection in a world that offered very little of it. Outside, the street had been cordoned off, not by ceremony, but by instinct. People simply knew better than to intrude. Harlem had buried kings before. It recognized the moment. Dean Martin arrived without an entourage and without spectacle. He wore a dark suit cut with the quiet elegance of another era. His tie nodded with care rather than flash. There were no cameras following him, no publicist whispering instructions, no attempt to announce his presence. He moved the way he always did, unhurried, observant, respectful. A few heads turned when he entered, surprised not by who he was, but by the fact that he had come at all. Hollywood rarely crossed this line, and when it did, it usually arrived loud and self-protective. Dean Martin arrived like a man paying a debt of respect that no one else needed to understand. He nodded once to the family, pressed a hand gently against the casket as if grounding himself, and took a seat near the back where he could listen rather than be seen. The air inside was thick with old grudges and unfinished business. There were men in that room who had been denied bank loans, refused apartments, followed home by police for existing in the wrong skin at the wrong hour. There were others who had benefited from those denials, who had made money from the same cruelty and now stood pretending grief made them equal. That was the injustice that hung heaviest, not the death itself, but the way power had always chosen sides, even in mourning. Dean felt it immediately. He had spent his life navigating rooms where prejudice wore tuxedos and smiled politely, where contracts were signed and dignity quietly set aside. He recognized the same tension here, just stripped of glamour. The silence wasn't peace. It was restraint. When Frank Lucas walked in, the room changed temperature. He didn't rush. He didn't smile. He carried a small leather case in his hand, worn at the edges, as if it had traveled a long way to be here. Frank had learned composure the hard way, by watching what happened to men who confused noise with strength. Some of the older figures shifted in their seats. A few whispered his name with caution. Others looked straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge him. Frank Lucas was not welcome in polite narratives, even among those who understood exactly how the world worked. He walked to the front, paused, and set the case down near the casket. When he opened it, there was no flourish. Just money, stacked neatly, deliberately, unmistakably. $100,000 in cash, placed without explanation, without apology. The whispers began immediately, sharp and judgmental. Some men scoffed, others bristled. There were those who saw it as arrogance, as provocation, as an attempt to buy legitimacy in a room that would never grant it. The funeral director hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. A few figures with polished shoes and practiced authority leaned toward each other, their expressions tightening. This was not how respect was supposed to look, they decided. This was not their language. The injustice surfaced in a new form, not loud, not violent, but deeply familiar. Who was allowed to mourn publicly? Who was allowed to give without being accused? Who decided what dignity looked like? Dean Martin watched all of it without moving. He had learned long ago that the loudest person in the room rarely held the most power. His eyes followed Frank's hands as they closed the case and rested briefly against the wood of the casket. There was something reverent in the gesture, something unperformative. Frank did not scan the room for approval. He did not explain himself. He simply stepped back, bowed his head once, and turned to leave. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. A voice, controlled, sharp, and entirely too comfortable with authority, cut through the room. It questioned the appropriateness of the gesture. It suggested rules, decorum, tradition. It implied, without naming it, that some men's respect was suspect by default. The words were measured, but the meaning was cruel. Dean felt it settle in his chest like a familiar ache. He had heard variations of that tone his entire career, had watched doors close politely on people who had earned the right to walk through them. This was the moment where humiliation could become official, where silence would become permission. Dean stood. It was not dramatic. He did not raise his voice. He did not posture or accuse. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and turned toward the voice with the calm certainty of a man who understood both the weight of rooms and the cost of speaking. When he spoke, it was conversational, almost gentle. He said that grief did not require approval. He said that respect did not come with a dress code. He said that the man who had just paid his respects had done so with honesty, and that honesty was the rarest currency any of them would ever hold. Then he added, quietly, that Bumpy Johnson had spent his life navigating rules written to exclude him, and that today, of all days, those rules could wait outside. The room fell into a silence, so complete it felt deliberate. The voice that had spoken before did not respond. The men who had leaned forward now leaned back. A few swallowed hard. Frank Lucas paused near the door, not turning around, not acknowledging the shift, but feeling it all the same. Dean did not look at him. He did not need to. The point had been made without spectacle, without threat. Just truth, placed carefully where it could not be ignored. Afterward, the funeral resumed with a different gravity. People listened more closely. They moved more carefully. A few men who had never bowed their heads did so now, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Dean returned to his seat and remained there until the end, leaving quietly the way he had come. Outside, the rain had softened. Harlem breathed again. What no one said out loud, but everyone understood, was that something had shifted. Not power, not allegiance, but permission. Permission to acknowledge dignity where it had always existed. Permission to let respect stand on its own, unchallenged. Dean Martin did not stay to receive thanks. He did not need it. He had come to witness a passing, and in doing so, had reminded a room full of hardened men that justice sometimes arrived without fists or headlines. Sometimes it arrived in a few well-chosen words, spoken at exactly the right moment. This was only the beginning. The tension stirred that day would not rest easily. Old resentments had been exposed, new lines drawn, and as Harlem returned to its rhythm, those who had been present at the funeral carried the silence with them, heavy and instructive. They would remember who had spoken, who had stood, and who had learned, perhaps for the first time, that real authority never announces itself, the silence that followed the bow. The days after the funeral did not move forward the way Harlem expected them to. Instead of returning to their familiar rhythm, they slowed, as if the neighborhood itself were listening for something that had not yet been said out loud. Men who had attended Bumpy Johnson's burial spoke less and remembered more. Conversations ended abruptly when Dean Martin's name surfaced, not because it carried fear, but because it carried a kind of authority none of them had been prepared to face. His words at the funeral had not challenged power directly, yet they had unsettled it in a way violence never could. Silence had followed him that day, and silence, everyone knew, was never empty. Dean returned to New York quietly, staying at a modest suite far from the glittering hotels that usually welcomed him. He did not come for publicity or charity galas. He came because something unresolved had followed him out of that funeral home. For decades, he had watched men with influence hide behind institutions while denying others basic dignity. He had learned to smile in rooms that quietly insulted him, to listen while contracts were negotiated on terms that favored familiarity over fairness. But what he had witnessed at Bumpy's funeral lingered differently. It was not just an insult aimed at Frank Lucas. It was a reminder that respect was still rationed, still controlled by those who believed they owned it. Word traveled quickly, though no one claimed responsibility for spreading it. Certain businessmen began making phone calls, testing waters, gauging whether Dean Martin's intervention had been symbolic or dangerous. A few figures with polished reputations and hidden leverage saw him as an inconvenience, a Hollywood man stepping into a world he did not understand. Others, particularly those who had lived under quiet humiliation for years, saw something else entirely. They saw a man who had used his standing not to dominate a room, but to correct it. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Frank Lucas heard the rumors the same way he heard everything else, through half sentences and cautious pauses. He understood power dynamics intimately. He knew when attention was shifting and when alliances were being tested. What surprised him was not Dean's presence at the funeral, but the aftermath. Doors that had always closed smoothly now hesitated. Meetings were postponed. Certain voices grew suddenly careful. Frank did not mistake this for loyalty or safety. He recognized it for what it was: uncertainty. And uncertainty, in a world built on rigid hierarchies, was dangerous. One evening, an invitation arrived at Dean's suite, handwritten and unsigned, requesting nothing more than a private conversation. No threats, no promises, just a place, a time, and the suggestion that the meeting would remain exactly that, private. Dean read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it on the table without comment. He had spent his life understanding subtext. This was not a trap, but it was a test. And tests, he knew, revealed more about the people who issued them than the ones who accepted. The room where they met was understated, chosen deliberately to strip away distractions. No guards hovered nearby. No music played to soften tension. Frank Lucas arrived first, standing near the window, his posture controlled but not defensive. When Dean entered, there were no handshakes, no formalities. Just a shared acknowledgement that what happened next mattered. Frank spoke first, not with gratitude, but with honesty. He said that the funeral had not been about money. It had been about respect, something Bumpy had fought for in a world determined to deny it. He said Dean's words had prevented something worse than humiliation. They had prevented erasure. Dean listened without interrupting. When he finally responded, his voice carried the same calm gravity it always did. He said he had not spoken for Frank Lucas. He had spoken for the room. He explained that when people in power misuse decorum to disguise cruelty, silence becomes complicity. And he had been silent enough in his life to recognize the cost. His tone was not accusatory. It was reflective, almost regretful. Frank absorbed the words slowly, as if weighing their implications. What neither man said, but both understood, was that forces beyond that room were already reacting. Certain individuals did not appreciate being corrected in public, especially by someone who did not belong to their world. They began quietly pressuring venues, sponsors, and social circles connected to Dean. Invitations disappeared. Phone calls went unanswered. It was subtle, sophisticated, and intentional. This was how punishment worked when brute force was inconvenient. Dean noticed, of course. He always did, but he did not respond with anger or demands. He simply continued as he always had, composed, precise, unyielding in his dignity. The real turning point came not through confrontation, but through absence. At a high-profile event meant to celebrate unity and progress, one of the city's most influential figures found himself standing alone on a stage without the validation he had carefully engineered. Dean Martin had declined the invitation. Quietly, publicly, without explanation. The silence that followed was louder than any speech. People noticed who was missing. More importantly, they noticed why. Conversations shifted. The narrative changed. What had begun as whispered disapproval now carried consequences. By the time Dean prepared to leave New York, the city felt different again, not healed but aware. Frank Lucas did not seek another meeting. He didn't need one. The message had been delivered without negotiation. Respect was not something that could be granted selectively without eventually being challenged. Dean left the city as he had entered it, without fanfare, without applause. But behind him, something irreversible had begun. Lines once drawn quietly had been exposed to light, and light, Dean knew, was never comfortable for those who thrived in shadow. This was not an ending. It was an escalation. The forces unsettled by Dean Martin's quiet defiance were already preparing their response. And somewhere between Hollywood and Harlem, a question now lingered that no one could ignore. What happens when dignity refuses to stay silent? When power decides to whisper back? The retaliation did not arrive with threats or raised voices. It came the way sophisticated cruelty always did, quietly, efficiently, wrapped in courtesy. Dean Martin first noticed it not in New York, but back in California, where the sun usually burned away such subtleties. A call from a longtime studio contact ended sooner than expected, the warmth replaced by careful distance. A charity event he had supported for years suddenly restructured its guest list. A venue that once begged for his presence claimed scheduling conflicts it had never mentioned before. None of it was dramatic. That was the point. The message was not meant to wound. It was meant to remind. Dean understood exactly what was happening. He had lived long enough in rooms of influence to recognize coordinated silence. Someone, somewhere, had decided that his words at Bumpy Johnson's funeral had crossed an invisible line. Not a legal one, not even a moral one, a social one. The unspoken agreement that certain injustices could be acknowledged privately but never corrected publicly, especially not by a man whose fame made him difficult to dismiss outright. Power did not want to punish Dean Martin openly. It wanted to isolate him gently, politely, until the lesson settled in. What unsettled those watching from the shadows was how little Dean reacted. He did not call anyone to complain. He did not issue statements or seek allies. He adjusted nothing about his demeanor or routine. He continued to arrive on time, dressed impeccably, treating everyone with the same courtesy he always had. The absence of resistance confused them. Men accustomed to leverage expected panic, bargaining, or at least visible frustration. Dean offered none of it. His calm was not defiance in the traditional sense. It was certainty, and certainty, when unmovable, made people nervous. Meanwhile, the ripple from Harlem continued to widen. Younger men, those who had inherited systems without questioning them, began to ask uncomfortable questions in private. Why had one sentence from a singer carried more weight than years of carefully managed authority? Why had the room gone silent so completely when he spoke? And why, weeks later, did that silence still linger? Older figures dismissed these questions as sentimentality, but they noticed the shift too. Respect, once rationed and controlled, had slipped through their fingers for a brief moment. They intended to reclaim it. The opportunity came during a benefit event in Los Angeles. One of those polished evenings meant to project progress without practicing it. The cause was noble, the speeches eloquent, the audience carefully curated. Dean had been invited early in the planning stages, his name used quietly to attract donors, then subtly sidelined as the final list took shape. On the night of the event, he attended anyway, not as a guest of honor, but as an observer. No one stopped him. No one greeted him with enthusiasm either. He was placed at a table near the back, just visible enough to acknowledge, just distant enough to diminish. The injustice that unfolded was quieter than the one in Harlem, but no less sharp. A speaker took the stage and spoke about equality, about opportunity, about dignity, as if it were an abstract concept rather than a lived struggle. The applause was automatic, rehearsed. Dean watched faces nod along to words they had never had to prove. Then came a moment that felt almost rehearsed in its cruelty. A young performer, talented, nervous, and visibly out of place, was introduced with patronizing humor, his background framed as novelty rather than achievement. Laughter followed, polite, cutting, the kind that excused itself as harmless. Dean felt the room lean into that laughter, felt the old mechanism engage, the one that allowed humiliation to masquerade as charm. He did not look away. He studied the faces of those laughing, noting who hesitated and who didn't. This was the same sickness he had seen at the funeral, dressed differently but driven by the same belief, that dignity could be managed, rationed, or mocked without consequence. When the applause died down, Dean stood. Again, there was no announcement, no dramatic pause. Chairs shifted. Conversation stopped. People recognized the posture before they recognized the intent. Dean did not take the stage. He did not ask for the microphone. He simply spoke from where he stood, his voice carrying with practiced ease. He said the performer deserved to be heard for his work, not framed as an exception. He said humor lost its innocence when it leaned on power rather than truth. And then he added, almost conversationally, that progress did not need speeches. It needed restraint. No one interrupted him. No one laughed this time. The young performer on stage froze, unsure what to do, until Dean nodded gently, signaling him to continue. The performance that followed was raw, unfiltered, and honest. When it ended, the applause was real. Uneven at first, then full. Some faces flushed with embarrassment. Others hardened with resentment. Dean sat back down, expression unchanged. The aftermath was immediate and invisible. Calls were made before the event ended. Opinions were formed. Lines were drawn more clearly now. Dean Martin was no longer an inconvenience. He was a variable, and variables threatened systems built on predictability. The men who had attempted to silence him realized something too late. His power did not depend on their approval. It came from something far more dangerous, moral clarity exercised sparingly. That night, alone in his car, Dean allowed himself a moment of reflection. He knew escalation when he felt it. The quiet punishments would grow bolder, the invitations fewer, the pressure heavier. But he also knew something else. Every time power tried to whisper him back into place, it exposed itself just a little more. And exposure, unlike silence, spread. Somewhere across the country, those who had watched him speak, at a funeral, at a benefit, in rooms never meant to hear dissent, began to carry the lesson forward. Dean Martin did not seek to lead a movement. He never had. But movements often began the same way, with one person refusing to let dignity be negotiated. The next response would not be subtle. Dean could feel it coming. And for the first time, the question was no longer whether he would speak again, but how much the world was willing to hear when he did. The invitation no one refused. The message arrived without stationery, without signature, and without pretense. It was delivered by a man who introduced himself only as a courier, his tone respectful, his posture careful, as if even standing too casually might be interpreted as a mistake. The note inside contained a single request and a single location. An invitation to attend a private gathering in New York, framed as a conversation about misunderstandings and shared interests. No threat was written, none needed. In certain circles, refusal was remembered longer than defiance. Dean Martin read the note once, folded it neatly, and placed it in his jacket pocket as if it were nothing more than a receipt. He understood what this was. Power had stopped whispering. It was ready to be heard. The gathering took place in a room designed to impress without warmth. Dark wood, muted lighting, art chosen not for beauty, but for cost. The men assembled there had built their lives on control, of markets, of narratives, of who was allowed to speak and when. They greeted Dean politely, carefully, each smile measured. No one mentioned Harlem. No one mentioned the benefit event. Instead, they spoke of unity, of stability, of the importance of staying within one's lane. It was all phrased as concern, as guidance, as if they were doing him a favor. Dean listened without interrupting, his expression calm, his hands resting loosely in front of him. He had spent years entertaining executives who mistook confidence for ownership. This was no different. The injustice revealed itself slowly, deliberately. They spoke of communities in abstract terms, of troubles that needed managing, of voices that complicated progress. One man suggested that public figures carried a responsibility not to inflame tensions. Another implied that Dean's recent interventions had consequences beyond what he understood. None of them accused him directly. That would have required courage. Instead, they framed restraint as wisdom and silence as maturity. The room waited for Dean to acknowledge the lesson. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft enough that they leaned forward to hear it. He said he agreed that public figures carried responsibility. He said he had spent his career honoring that responsibility by choosing words carefully and actions even more so. Then he paused, not for effect, but because he wanted them to feel the space he left. He told them that restraint when used to protect comfort instead of dignity, stopped being wisdom and became fear. He added that silence was only maturity when it did not excuse cruelty. The words landed without force, but they landed exactly where intended. The men exchanged glances. This was not the response they had rehearsed. They had expected negotiation, perhaps an apology wrapped in charm. Instead, they were being corrected, politely, irrevocably. One of them attempted to regain control by reframing the conversation, suggesting that Dean's intentions were admirable but naive. That was when Dean changed the room. He said intentions were irrelevant. Impact was what endured. And impact, he reminded them, had a way of outliving influence. What followed was not an argument, but a realization. Dean Martin was not asking permission, and he was not seeking protection. His power did not come from alliances they could sever or platforms they could deny. It came from a reputation built carefully over decades, from the trust of people who recognized integrity when they saw it. They could not threaten him without exposing themselves, and they could not silence him without confirming everything he had implied. The room understood this too late. When Dean stood to leave, no one stopped him. The invitation had been issued to contain him. Instead, it had clarified the boundaries of their authority. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the quiet recalibration that had just taken place. But inside that room, something fragile had cracked. The men left one by one, each carrying the uncomfortable knowledge that dignity, once defended publicly, could not be put back into private boxes. News of the meeting never reached the papers, yet its effects traveled faster than any headline. Invitations returned cautiously. Doors reopened reluctantly. More importantly, people began to speak differently around Dean, choosing their words with a care that bordered on respect. Frank Lucas heard about the gathering weeks later through a chain of conversations that ended in silence. He understood what it meant. The rules had not changed, but the cost of enforcing them had risen. Dean did not celebrate this shift. He had learned long ago that victories built on humiliation were temporary. Instead, he prepared for what came next. Because when power was forced to reveal itself and failed to prevail, it did not disappear. It adapted. And Dean knew that adaptation often came wearing a friendlier face. Somewhere between Hollywood and Harlem, a line had been drawn, not by threats or money, but by the refusal to let dignity be negotiated behind closed doors. The men who had tried to contain him now watched carefully, uncertain of his next move. Dean Martin, calm as ever, offered them no clues. He simply continued forward, carrying with him the quiet certainty that the most dangerous thing to entrench power was not rebellion, but composure backed by truth. The next chapter would not unfold in boardrooms or benefit halls. It would unfold where silence had once been enforced most successfully, out in the open, where witnesses could no longer be managed. And when that moment arrived, everyone would remember the night they had been given a chance to choose restraint over fear, and realize too late which one Dean Martin had already chosen: the room where silence was expected. The next move did not come from a man Dean had faced in private rooms or polished halls. It came from somewhere far more public, far more dangerous, a place where silence had always been enforced not by threats, but by tradition. A nationally televised tribute was announced, an evening meant to celebrate legacy, unity, and American greatness. It would be watched by millions, dissected by critics, and remembered by history. Dean Martin's name appeared on the program not as a headliner, but as a presenter, a symbolic role carefully chosen. The invitation was framed as reconciliation, as acknowledgement, as an olive branch extended just far enough to seem sincere. Dean understood the intent immediately. This was not forgiveness. It was containment. They believed that placing him on a controlled stage, bound by time limits and expectations, would neutralize whatever quiet authority he carried. Cameras had a way of disciplining people. Scripts made disobedience expensive. This room, this broadcast, was designed to remind him where power truly lived. He accepted without hesitation. On the night of the event, the theater shimmered with curated elegance. Every seat filled by someone who understood appearances, every smile rehearsed. Dean waited backstage, listening to applause roll like controlled thunder through the walls. He did not review notes. He did not ask for changes. When his name was called, he stepped into the light with the same measured composure that had unsettled rooms far more intimate than this one. The segment before his was polished and hollow, full of broad praise and careful omissions. When Dean reached the microphone, the applause was respectful but restrained, approval without enthusiasm. He waited for it to fade completely before speaking. That pause alone created tension. Viewers leaned closer without knowing why. He began as expected, acknowledging legacy, artistry, and shared history. His tone was warm, familiar. The audience relaxed. This was the Dean Martin they knew, the voice that soothed, the presence that reassured. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted. He spoke of respect not as an abstract ideal, but as a daily practice. He spoke of rooms where laughter had once disguised cruelty, where silence had been mistaken for agreement. He did not name names. He did not accuse. He simply described patterns with such clarity that recognition did the rest. The atmosphere changed. Somewhere backstage, a producer stiffened. In living rooms across the country, viewers sensed something real unfolding beneath the ceremony. Dean's words were not inflammatory. They were precise. He said that dignity did not need permission to exist. He said that progress measured itself not by applause, but by who was allowed to stand without being diminished. And then he did something no one had planned for. He paused and looked directly into the camera. Not dramatically, not defiantly, just directly. He said that moments like this, public, polished, controlled, were often used to reassure people that everything was fine. But history, he reminded them gently, was written not by comfort, but by conscience. The silence that followed was absolute. The applause cue never came. The orchestra did not play him off. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Dean smiled, softly, almost sadly, and concluded by dedicating the moment to those who had been asked too often to wait their turn for respect. He stepped away from the microphone before anyone could stop him. The applause arrived late and uneven, like rain after a drought. Some stood. Some remained seated. All were aware that something irreversible had just occurred. The fallout was immediate and chaotic. Fullness rang backstage. Statements were drafted and discarded. Commentators argued over intent, over tone, over propriety. But the broadcast could not be undone. The words were already traveling, already landing where they were never meant to go. The injustice that had lived comfortably in coded language had been translated into something undeniable. Dean did not attend the after-party. He left through a side entrance, unnoticed by most, and returned home without ceremony. He knew what would follow, attempts to reinterpret, to minimize, to reclaim control. But he also knew something else. Once witnessed, dignity was difficult to dismiss. Once spoken aloud, truth refused to retreat. In Harlem, in Hollywood, in rooms where silence had once been expected, people began to speak more carefully and listen more closely. The men who had tried to manage Dean's influence now understood the cost of underestimating it. He had not attacked them. He had outgrown them. And somewhere in the space between applause and outrage, a line had been crossed. Not by force, not by outrage, but by a calm, deliberate refusal to let injustice hide behind ceremony. The world would respond. It always did. The only question left was whether it would do so with humility or fear,